Hi everyone, thanks for coming back for part 2. I want to talk a little bit more about the constellation Taurus, and in particular I want to talk about the two horns in the constellation Taurus because I believe they have a very similar meaning as the constellation Gemini. You see that here in the constellation Gemini, the two twins represent, according to the Gospel and the Stars, they represent the two comings of Christ. The first time he comes to be wounded or bruised, but then he returns to fight and vanquish his enemies. And this is also what Mark Biltz was saying in this video over here. He's pointing out this star over here at the very tip of the constellation Taurus, which is the star Elnath. And I'll show that to you right here. It's at the very tip of the horn of Taurus, and this star is actually shared by the constellation Aries. You see it mentioned here where it's talking about the constellation Aries. You see it mentions the star Elnath, which the first part is El, which means God, and then the second part is Nath, which means broken or cut in pieces or poured out, or it can also mean wounded, as Mark Biltz had pointed out in his video. So you have one horn with the star Elnath, which means wounded, but then you also have the two horns, which I believe represent the two comings of Christ, because there are some other scriptures that Mark Biltz talks about that refer to the second coming. And one of those scriptures is Deuteronomy 33:17, and I think it's interesting that it comes up in verse 17. I've been noticing that number come up a lot in scriptures that have to do with the second coming. And in this one it says, "His glory is like the firstling of his bullock, and his horns are like the horns of unicorns. With them he shall push the people together to the ends of the earth. They are the 10,000s of Ephraim, and they are the thousands of Manasseh." So here you have a mention of Ephraim and Manasseh, which I believe represent the Jews and the Gentiles, but I believe they also represent DNA. This is an image from Genesis 48, where Jacob, or Israel, is giving the blessing to Ephraim and Manasseh, and as you can see in this picture, he puts his right hand on Ephraim and his left hand on Manasseh, and you see that mentioned over here. It says Joseph took them both, Ephraim in his right hand toward Israel's left hand, and Manasseh in his left hand toward Israel's right hand, and brought them near unto him. And Israel stretched out his right hand and laid it on Ephraim's head, who was the younger, and his left hand upon Manasseh's head, guiding his hands wittingly, for Manasseh was the firstborn. And so I want to talk a little more about why I believe this is alluding to the two types of DNA, but I believe it's also alluding to the two witnesses, as well as the Jews and the Gentiles, which is what Mark Biltz had stated in this video as well. And I'm going to go ahead and try to play a little bit of this. I'm just going to raise the volume so that you can hear it, and then I'll just play a little bit of this video.
So let's go back. You have SAR. Okay, you put in a vase. You get the bowl, and then you get shofar. Isn't that fascinating how these are all tied together? You have the bull, the prince, and the shofar. And what does Deuteronomy 33:17 say? Let me see if I got here. Okay, Deuteronomy, now I like to stick with the Bible. Look at Deuteronomy 33:17. His glory is like what? Taurus. The heavens declare the glory of God, and here he's saying his glory is like what? The Taurus, like a firstborn bull. His horns, like the horns of the wild ox. Together with them he shall do what? Gore the people to the ends of the earth. They are the 10,000s of Ephraim and the thousands of Manasseh. Why? In Jeremiah 31:9, Ephraim is my firstborn. So this ox not only represents the Aleph and God, but represents God's firstborn, Ephraim and Manasseh, who with their horns are going to push the people to the ends of the earth. Let's break for lunch. And I'll go ahead and finish, and then we'll have Danny. It's okay if I take a little bit more after lunch? Let me see, I got a few more pages here. But it is, wait till you see what's coming. Let me just see a good place to stop. If I go a little bit more, let me see. I mean, you can see why I got excited about this. Okay, let me read. I'll read. Okay, I'm going to read you just another couple more verses. Okay, and then we'll go to lunch. Look at Isaiah 34. This is verse 1 through 8. And what does he say? Come near. Just like the word bow. He says, come near, you nations, to hear. It's like he's shaking the nations. You listen up, you nations. I'm talking to you. And he says, and heed you people, let the earth hear and all that is in it, the world and all the things that come forth from it. The indignation of the Lord is against all nations. His fury against all their armies. He's utterly destroyed them. He's given them over to the slaughter. Also their slain will be thrown out. Their stench will rise from their corpses. The mountains will be melted with their blood. The host of heaven will be dissolved. The heavens will be rolled up like a scroll. Their hosts will fall down as the leaf falls from the vine, as the fruit falls from a fig tree. My sword has been bathed in heaven. Remember in Revelation, what does he have in his hand? And out of his mouth was coming a sharp sword. And indeed it will come down on Edom and on the people of my curse for judgment. The sword of the Lord is filled with blood. It is made overflowing with fatness, with the blood of lambs and goats, the fat of kidneys of rams. The Lord is a sacrifice in Biltz, and a great slaughter in the land of Edom. And then look what it says. The wild oxen will come down with them. This is with the host of heaven. The wild ox is coming down. The young bulls with the mighty bulls. Their land will be soaked with blood, their dust saturated with fatness, for the day of the Lord's vengeance, the year of recompense, for the cause of who? Isn't this interesting? So this whole constellation Taurus is pictured in the heavens, and it's written in the book. It is the prophecy of a coming judge and coming judgment that is coming. Look at Psalm 44, 4 and 5. You are my king, O God. Command deliverances for Jacob. Through you we will what? Push down our enemies. It's through your name we'll tread them under that rise up against us. We are not to be afraid of these last days. We're going to be the wild ox, the ones of Ephraim and Judah that are open. The word there means to war or to butt with the horns. Okay, so what's going on in the heavens is a sign of what's coming on earth. I don't know if it's a mile ahead or 8 feet ahead. But this is what God has been telling us. It's coming since 1994. He's been warning us of this coming judgment, so he's gracious.
Okay, so that was my favorite part of the video. I love the part where he said we're not to fear the last days, that we're Ephraim and Manasseh, or I believe he said Ephraim and Judah, but he talks about Isaiah 34, 1 through 8, where it talks about the entire host of heaven, and I'll go ahead and pull that up and show it to you. Okay, it's over here in Isaiah 34, 1 through 8, and you see here the entire host of heaven, and they're depicted as bulls and bullocks coming down to make war, for it is the day of the Lord's vengeance and the year of recompense for the controversy in Zion. And then he goes on to mention Psalm 44, verses 4 and 5, where it says, Thou art my king, O God, command deliverances for Jacob. Through thee we will push down our enemies. through thy name we will tread them under that rise up against us. And the word for push down in the Hebrew is a word that means to push, thrust, or gore, or to strike with the horn. Okay, so that's another image of Taurus, the bull, coming to make war, butting his horns against the enemy, which would be represented by the constellation Orion. And so I want to talk a little more about these two horns, why I believe they're synonymous with the constellation Gemini. I believe they represent the same thing. I believe they represent the two comings of Christ, as well as the two witnesses, which I believe are represented by the Jews and the Gentiles, as well as the restoration of the DNA, which I believe is what is being depicted here in what Israel did when he blessed Ephraim and Manasseh, and when he crossed his hands over and put his right hand on Ephraim and his left hand on Manasseh. I want to explain what I believe this imagery represents and what I believe it has to do with DNA. But first, I want to go back to Job 38, and you see over here, starting with verse 1, you see the Lord is answering Job out of the whirlwind, and he's talking about all the things that only God can do. And then when you get down to verse 31 is where it says, canst thou bind the sweet influences of Pleiades, or loose the bands of Orion? Because this is something that only God can do. So that's why he's asking, can you do that? And I mentioned earlier how the word for sweet influences is a word that means bands or bands. So it's basically saying, can you bind the bands of Pleiades, which represents a church, or loose the bands of Orion? And the word for bands in this instance is a word that means cords or a fetter or chain, as you see here. Okay, so I wanted to talk about this word over here because I want to show you how this is the same imagery that is represented in Zechariah 14. This is actually the root word that I was talking about, that is the root of the word seal, but it's also root of this word which means obstructed or fenced in. And so when the Mount of Olives cleaves, it's going to be obstructed or fenced in or sealed in the valley or the belly of the mountains, and will be joined together, the mountains, all the way into Azal. But before it joins together, it has to cleave. And that's what's being represented here in Job 38, when the bands are loosed or this barrier is broken. And when you put this word in the Strong's, you see that it means a fence or barrier. See that word here? It means a hedge, fence, or partition. But it's really interesting the other occurrences of this word, and one of those occurrences is Ephesians 2:14. It's interesting that it comes up in verse 14, but it's where it's talking about Jesus breaking down the middle wall of partition. And the word for broken down here in the Greek is a word that means to loose or untie. So Jesus is the one who looses the middle wall of partition. He's also the one who looses the bands of Orion. And he's also the one who looses the bands to Cetus, the sea monster. And so I want to explain what this all has to do with DNA, but I'll have to do that in the next video. Thank you.